this great honor to be able to share the story of my uncle who served during World War II. And it's a story of courage. For many of you, you have somebody like my uncle who served. And we celebrate Veterans Day by remembering those living, fallen, and those who have passed into history. And by remembering, we keep real those memories. We keep them alive in a way. It's our responsibility not only just to share these memories, but to make them real. My uncle was very much real. He can't come here today, his health is failing, but he is as real as the man I visited at Serenity House in hospice care off of Korea Street. A couple times a week I go see him. He's the last of his generation of Moris, Santa Barbara Moris, that had a farm where Lazy Acres is today. There were 4 children. My uncle was the eldest. My father was the third. There was also a brother between them, and my aunt was also passed away. My grandparents came from Japan to America in the early part of the 20th century, and they grew success in the form of flowers and then vegetables before World War II. And they also farmed the land that's above Harvard, that's what is now Santa Barbara City College. I'm proud to say that all 3 of those brothers served in the military during World War II, which included my father Joe. In fact, many of my relatives did serve. My mother's cousin has probably the most interesting story. We didn't know what he did for many years. He was sworn to secrecy after the war because he was in a place where he wasn't supposed to be. It was not until the 1970s when China opened up the United States through Nixon and Kissinger that we found out what he really did. He was stationed as part of a small military intelligence, and he was attached to Chairman Mao. And when Mao made the relationship with Kissinger and then Nixon, he invited the old Japanese-American intelligence group out to China, and they were honored guests. But today, I want to pay tribute, as I said, to my Uncle Frank. On the basis of his service alone, there is a reason to recognize him. He was the very first Japanese-American to set foot on Japanese soil during the war. He was with the 77th Infantry as they landed in Okinawa. In addition to Okinawa, he served on the Guam campaign and also in the Philippines. After the war, immediately from Okinawa, he went directly to Japan, to occupy Japan, to northern Japan, to Hokkaido, to the city of Sapporo, you might know the year, and so on. He was stationed there. During those really dark times, the first couple of months of the occupation were really, really difficult, and he was there and came home afterwards. But, there were many Japanese Americans who served during the war, and my uncle was only one of them. And there are other reasons why I want to honor him today. But first, let me talk about some of the Japanese Americans. In Europe, you may know about the 442nd. 442nd was formed in 1943, April 1943, an initial group of 4,000 soldiers. They have the distinction of being the most decorated unit of its size during World War II, but unfortunately, the highest casualty rate. In fact, they lost so many men that they had to fill that group of 4,000 2.5 times. There were over 9,500 Purple Hearts that were awarded to them, many presidential citations. However, no Congressional Medal of Honors until the year 2000, when the records were reviewed and these 21 men were then honored. Among these Japanese Americans, there are many heroes. So you might ask, why is my Uncle Frank my hero? It's not only his military service, but the circumstances of his military service that really impressed me. While Americans mobilized after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans lived in fear. Fear for their future, fear for their lives. were the very first to be picked up by the FBI. Army General John DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense Command, had a very high distrust of Japanese Americans, and he recommended their evacuation from the coastal states of California, Oregon, and Washington. In spite of the Navy intelligence reports that recommended against that, as well as the FBI report, and all the discrediting by the FCC of incorrect and reports of espionage by Japanese Americans, President Roosevelt sealed their fate, and they were all moved away from their homes during the war. The Mori family, which I mentioned earlier, had to pack their farm, and they would travel from here to Tulare Assembly Center near Fresno, and then by the Tequila River in Arizona near Phoenix to a prison camp, essentially, euphemistically called internment camps. Everywhere there were soldiers. In Santa Barbara, at the train station, there were soldiers with rifles, with bayonets. And in Tulare, there was barbed wire, as well as guard towers with machine guns. But the machine guns were turned inwards. This is the circumstances for which the Japanese Americans had to spend the war. This is the beginning of my uncle's incredulous journey into the war. It is under these circumstances that he volunteered. At the beginning of the war, all active duty Japanese Americans were immediately reclassified as 4C, enemy aliens. And Japanese Americans were not allowed to enlist into the military until almost a year and a half later. And at that opportunity, that is when my uncle volunteered out of an internment camp. For this is so much hard to believe that this could happen. The best thing I could mention to you or came to mind is after 9/11 and seeing all those soldiers at the airport. Myself and my family, my parents, we were in Japan, couldn't get back to the United States, and we flew back to LAX. And LAX was a desert, no cars were going through there at all. Those roads were desolate, and the place was filled with soldiers, really imposing with their in full battle gear and so on. And if you can imagine what that felt like to be, they were there to protect us, obviously, but in 1942, those men were there to guard. I asked him recently why he volunteered. And he had a story to tell me. He says, Uncle, why did you volunteer under these circumstances? And he says, let me tell you a story. In 1939, his parents sent him to Japan as a graduation present from high school. He entered a judo competition and was taken there. It was a summer-long journey. And on the long journey boat trip back from Japan that took over 2 weeks, they were finally approaching America. And out of the distance he tells me the story as it was yesterday, with his eyes closed and with his fists holding and clenching and shaking as he tells me the story. He says, out in the distance, he could see the Golden Gate Bridge. And at that moment he says, I felt the tears coming through my blood. And he says, I knew at that moment I was an American and I was coming home. And this is the reason why I enlisted. It's an amazing story, the bravery of all these Americans of Japanese descent. If you can imagine, the whole of Santa Barbara, there was about 120,000 Japanese Americans that were in prison during the war. And that's the population of Santa Barbara. And they lost everything. Before they left, here in Santa Barbara, we're familiar with fires. Well, it was the biggest fire sale that you had ever seen for these Japanese Americans. Everybody, all the buyers knew exactly when the Japanese were leaving. And they were waiting for those prices to come down. My uncle said that he had to sell his car finally for the price of the bicycle. The prices were that low. In spite of all this and volunteering, to this day, there is no bitterness about these circumstances in him. And that makes my uncle my hero. At war's end, he came back to Santa Barbara and he mentioned what DJ did for most Americans. And soldiers were going home. But for my uncle, he says, as he heard other people talking about going home and thoughts of all these things of what that would be like, for him, his home was gone. There was no family there. There was no familiar childhood home to come back to. There was none of that. But adopted and eager to begin a new life as a married couple. He got married while in camp and had a daughter there. He came back to Santa Barbara and started a new life. There was no bitterness. You see, there's something about my uncle that you have to understand why he's not bitter. Kindness means so much to him. Well, on the invasion of Okinawa, he mentions to me not the exploits of battle, or the blood, or the death, but he mentions kindness. He mentions to me about getting Japanese citizens to surrender. He mentions to me the kindness extended to Japanese prisoners, getting them to Japanese soldiers to surrender, and the treatment afterwards. He marvels at the appreciation of the kindness that was there. He helped a young woman who was in the midst of labor, and within hours of taking her out of the caves at Okinawa, she delivered a baby. And he was able to meet that child in the 1980s, once again in Okinawa. It is my uncle's kindness that impresses me. You see, my Uncle Frank is a courageous soldier. He had the courage to believe in this country when this country did not believe in him. He had the courage not to allow bitterness to prevail. He had the courage to be kind instead. He has the courage to endure. The Japanese have a word for this. It's somewhat untranslatable. It's the word gamon. Gamon kind of means, often translated as to endure, but it means to, when all circumstances tell you not to do something, it encourages you to persist and to endure. From all these stories, I know that his gamon has American blood flowing through it. Finally, and most importantly, he has the courage to forgive. In these last days, we have conversations. On these last days, as he's facing death, he speaks often about forgiveness to me. Forgiveness is so important. He says that this forgiveness comes from a deep religious faith, and I believe him. My Uncle Frank is that good soldier. Patriotism, honor, service, and courage are far more than just words for him. He has lived